There was a moment when one heavy equipment company made a decision that, at the time, seemed almost insane. It wasn't the biggest manufacturer in the industry. It didn't have the deepest pockets. And it certainly didn't have the kind of global dominance that would make anyone expect it to reshape an entire machine category. But CNC Equipment saw something that almost everyone else was ignoring. They made one unconventional choice, and the consequences would reach far beyond their own company. At first, it looked like a gamble. Heavy equipment had always been built around familiar rules. Bigger machines, more horsepower, stronger frames, heavier components, and increasingly expensive technology. Contractors knew what they were buying, manufacturers knew what they were selling, and the industry had settled into a comfortable rhythm. But CNC Equipment was looking at the problem from a completely different angle. Instead of asking how to make heavy equipment bigger and more powerful, they began asking a much more dangerous question. What if the entire approach was wrong? That question mattered because heavy equipment isn't just about machines. Every excavator, loader, dozer, and specialized piece of machinery represents an enormous investment. Fuel costs can determine whether a project makes money or loses it. Downtime can destroy schedules. Maintenance can quietly eat away at profits. And when a machine spends thousands of hours working under brutal conditions, even a small design decision can have massive consequences over its lifetime. CNC understood this better than most. They knew equipment operators weren't impressed simply because a machine looked powerful. They wanted machines that worked harder, lasted longer, cost less to operate, and could survive punishment that would destroy lesser equipment. But achieving all of that usually meant accepting compromises somewhere else. More strength meant more weight. More power meant more fuel. More complexity meant more maintenance. There was no easy answer. Then CNC made its crazy decision. Instead of following the path everyone else was taking, the company chose to challenge one of the assumptions that had quietly controlled heavy equipment for years. And once that decision was made, there was no going back. What happened afterward would reveal just how far ahead, or how dangerously wrong, the company really was. The strange part is that the decision didn't immediately look revolutionary. There was no dramatic announcement that changed the industry overnight. No giant machine suddenly appeared and made every competitor obsolete. The transformation began much more quietly, inside the engineering decisions that most people would never notice. But those decisions were about to create a ripple effect. Because when you change the way a heavy machine is designed, you don't just change the machine. You change the way operators work, the economics of construction projects, the expectations of contractors, and eventually what competitors are forced to build themselves. And CNC was about to discover that challenging the industry's rules comes with a price. The company had taken its first step towards something that could either become one of the smartest moves in heavy equipment history, or one of the biggest mistakes it had ever made. And before anyone could know which one it would be, CNC had to prove that its crazy idea could actually survive in the real world. Because the machines were about to leave the drawing board and enter the dirt. The first real test came when CNC's ideas moved from engineering rooms into the harsh environments where heavy equipment either proves itself or gets exposed. On paper, almost any machine can look impressive. Specifications can promise strength, efficiency, durability, and performance. But a construction site doesn't care about brochures. Mud doesn't care about engineering predictions. Rock doesn't care about horsepower ratings. And operators certainly don't care about a machine that looks good but cannot survive a full day's work. CNC knew that. So instead of simply chasing the biggest numbers, the company focused on what happened after the machine was put to work. Every hour mattered. Every breakdown mattered. Every unnecessary movement translated into lost fuel, lost productivity, and lost money. This was where the company's unusual philosophy began to make sense. The goal wasn't necessarily to build the most intimidating machine in the yard. The goal was to build a machine that could keep working when everything around it became difficult. That philosophy slowly began attracting attention. Operators started noticing details that weren't immediately obvious to outsiders. The machine behaved differently. Its design seemed to prioritize practical performance rather than simply maximizing specifications. Controls, visibility, balance, service access, and the relationship between power and efficiency all became part of a larger equation. None of those things alone would revolutionize heavy equipment. But together, they created something competitors couldn't easily ignore. And this was where CNC's biggest advantage began to appear. The company wasn't trying to win every argument with raw power. It was trying to make the machine smarter about how that power was used. In an industry where bigger had traditionally been associated with better, that was a dangerous idea. If customers discovered they could accomplish the same work with a more intelligently designed machine, manufacturers would eventually have to rethink what they were selling. But success brought another problem. Once people started paying attention, expectations changed. Customers wanted to know whether CNC's approach could survive heavy workloads over months and years, not just perform well during demonstrations. Contractors wanted reliability. Operators wanted comfort and control. Owners wanted predictable operating costs. And everyone wanted proof that the unusual decisions inside these machines would actually translate into more money saved at the end of a project. The pressure was enormous. CNC had reached the point where it could no longer hide behind engineering theory. Its machines had to perform in quarries, construction sites, demolition projects, farms, and other environments where mistakes become expensive very quickly. A single failure could give critics exactly what they needed to dismiss the entire philosophy. But instead of backing away, CNC doubled down. The company continued refining the concept, learning from operators and real-world conditions rather than relying exclusively on traditional industry assumptions. That feedback loop became crucial. Every difficult job revealed another weakness to solve. Every successful project revealed another possibility. And gradually, the company was discovering that the original decision wasn't just about one machine. It was about an entirely different way of thinking. Yet there was something else happening in the background. While CNC was refining its approach, the heavy equipment industry itself was changing. Customers were becoming more focused on operating costs. Fuel prices could suddenly turn a profitable project into a financial headache. Regulations were becoming more demanding. Technology was becoming more sophisticated. And machines were being expected to do more while consuming fewer resources. Suddenly, the question CNC had been asking didn't sound so crazy anymore. What if the future of heavy equipment wasn't simply about making machines stronger? What if it was about making every component, every movement, and every ounce of power work harder? That realization put CNC on a collision course with the established way of doing things. Because if its philosophy worked, competitors couldn't simply ignore it forever. They would have to respond. And that's when the story became much bigger than CNC itself. The company had started with one unconventional decision. Now that decision was beginning to challenge an industry built around decades of tradition. But proving that the idea worked was only half the battle. The real test was coming, and it would force CNC to find out just how much customers were willing to trust a company that refused to play by the old rules. Because once the industry noticed what CNC was doing, there was no going back. The moment CNC's approach began gaining attention, the company faced a problem it could no longer avoid. It was one thing to build equipment differently. It was another thing entirely to convince an industry built on decades of tradition that different could actually be better. Heavy equipment buyers are not known for taking unnecessary risks. A machine can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and sometimes far more. If that machine fails on a major job, the consequences can spread through an entire project. So when CNC started challenging conventional thinking, skepticism was inevitable. Some questioned whether the company was simply trying to be different for the sake of being different. Others wondered whether its unusual engineering philosophy could actually deliver under extreme conditions. And then came the most important question of all. Would customers trust it enough to put CNC equipment on the line when failure wasn't an option? That question created the turning point. The machines began facing the kind of work that exposes every weakness. Hard ground, heavy loads, long operating hours, constant cycles, difficult weather. Jobs where equipment isn't given the luxury of taking a break whenever something becomes uncomfortable. Under those conditions, a machine's real character starts to emerge. And gradually, something unexpected happened. The conversation around CNC began shifting from what the company claimed to what its machines were actually doing. Operators weren't interested in marketing language. They cared about whether the machine responded when they needed it, whether it could maintain productivity throughout the day, whether maintenance was manageable, and whether the equipment could keep earning money instead of sitting idle. Those experiences began creating a new kind of credibility. But success also exposed the weaknesses of the old system. If CNC could prove that intelligent design and practical efficiency mattered as much as brute force, then some long-standing assumptions in heavy equipment suddenly became questionable. Why should a machine automatically be considered better simply because it was larger? Why should more horsepower always be the answer? And why should operators accept unnecessary complexity if a simpler solution could accomplish the same job? Those questions were uncomfortable because they didn't just challenge individual machines. They challenged an entire mindset. And the industry was beginning to notice. Competitors had spent years refining their own formulas. They knew what customers expected and what specifications looked impressive on paper. But CNC's approach suggested that the next competitive battle might not be fought over who could build the biggest machine. It might be fought over who could extract the greatest amount of useful work from every component. That was a much more complicated race. Because copying the appearance of a successful machine is easy. Copying the thinking behind it is not. CNC's decisions were rooted in a broader understanding of how equipment actually gets used. The operator, the machine, the job site, fuel consumption, maintenance, productivity, and long-term ownership costs all had to work together. A change in one area could create consequences somewhere else. The challenge was finding the balance. And that balance became CNC's obsession. The company kept pushing forward, even as the expectations became higher. Every improvement created another demand. Better efficiency raised questions about durability. Better performance raised questions about cost. More technology raised questions about reliability. There was always another problem waiting behind the one that had just been solved. Then came the moment that changed the stakes. CNC's philosophy had reached a point where it could no longer remain an interesting alternative. It was starting to become a direct challenge to the established players. If customers continued embracing the idea, larger manufacturers would have to pay attention. And once the giants of the industry start watching a smaller competitor, the pressure becomes enormous. Because now the question wasn't whether CNC had made an unusual decision. The question was whether that decision was powerful enough to change what the entire industry believed a heavy machine should be. And that is where the story takes a darker turn. The same philosophy that helped CNC stand apart was also creating new pressure, new expectations, and new risks. The company had challenged the old rules. But challenging the rules is easy compared with surviving the consequences. And soon, CNC would discover that changing heavy equipment forever might require sacrificing far more than anyone expected. The pressure began building in ways that weren't always visible from the outside. CNC had spent years proving that a different approach to heavy equipment could work, but success created a new problem. People now expected the company to keep delivering. Once customers become accustomed to better performance, lower operating costs, or smarter engineering, going backward is no longer an option. Every new machine had to justify the reputation the previous ones had created. And that is where the real challenge began. Heavy equipment is brutally unforgiving. A passenger vehicle might spend most of its life traveling on relatively predictable roads, but construction machinery can spend thousands of hours fighting dirt, rock, heat, dust, vibration, and enormous loads. Components that look perfect in a factory can behave very differently after months of abuse. A design decision that saves weight can create stress somewhere else. A system that improves efficiency can introduce new maintenance requirements. Even a small weakness can eventually become a major expense. CNC had to deal with that reality head-on. The company couldn't simply celebrate the success of its original idea. It had to keep improving it. Engineers had to examine what worked, what failed, and what operators were discovering in the field. Customers became part of the development process, whether they realized it or not. Their experiences exposed problems that laboratory testing could never completely reproduce. This was both an advantage and a danger. Every difficult job gave CNC valuable information, but every problem also gave competitors ammunition. In an industry where reputation can determine whether a contractor buys one machine or an entire fleet, perception matters almost as much as performance. One highly publicized failure can make buyers question everything else the company has accomplished. CNC therefore found itself walking a narrow line. It had to remain innovative without becoming reckless. It had to introduce new ideas without making machines unnecessarily complicated. It had to improve performance while protecting the reliability customers depended on. And behind all of this was the original decision that had started the entire chain reaction. The decision to think differently had opened a door, but that door had led into a much larger room. The company had helped demonstrate that heavy equipment could be approached from a different perspective. Instead of measuring success only by size, weight, and raw power, manufacturers increasingly had to consider productivity, operator experience, efficiency, serviceability, and the total cost of ownership. The industry was slowly beginning to understand that the most impressive machine wasn't always the one with the biggest numbers. Sometimes, the smartest machine was the one that wasted the least. That realization had consequences far beyond CNC. Manufacturers began facing customers who were asking better questions. Contractors were paying closer attention to fuel consumption and downtime. Operators expected better ergonomics and control. Fleet owners wanted equipment that could deliver predictable returns instead of unpredictable repair bills. The old definition of heavy equipment was changing. But CNC's story wasn't simply about technology. It was about timing. The company had challenged conventional thinking just as the industry was becoming more desperate for solutions to problems that traditional approaches couldn't easily solve. Rising operating costs, increasing environmental pressure, tighter project margins, and growing technological expectations were forcing manufacturers to rethink what mattered. Suddenly, the crazy decision didn't look quite so crazy. In fact, it looked like a warning. The companies that refused to adapt risked being left behind, while those willing to question old assumptions had an opportunity to redefine the market. But there was still one question that had never been fully answered. Did CNC actually change heavy equipment forever? Or did the industry simply borrow the ideas that worked and move on without giving the company the credit? Because sometimes the biggest influence isn't the company that becomes the largest. Sometimes it's the company that forces everyone else to change. And as the dust settled, the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. The decision CNC had made had created effects far beyond its original machines. But the final truth was still hidden. Because what happened next would reveal whether CNC's greatest legacy was the equipment it built, or the way it changed what the entire industry believed was possible. By this point, the real impact of CNC's decision was no longer limited to the company itself. The most important change was happening in the way people thought about heavy equipment. For decades, the industry had been built around a familiar formula: more power, more capacity, more steel, and bigger machines. But CNC's philosophy challenged the idea that progress always had to mean simply adding more. The bigger realization was that heavy equipment is ultimately a productivity machine. Its value isn't determined by how impressive it looks sitting in a yard. Its value is measured by what it can accomplish hour after hour, day after day, while controlling the costs that come with doing that work. Fuel, maintenance, downtime, operator fatigue, serviceability, and reliability all become part of the equation. And once buyers begin looking at equipment through that lens, the definition of a great machine changes completely. That may have been the most important legacy of CNC's approach. The company helped demonstrate the power of questioning assumptions. Instead of automatically accepting the way things had always been done, engineers and manufacturers could ask whether every component actually needed to work the way it had worked for decades. Could the machine be more efficient? Could an operator accomplish more with less effort? Could maintenance become easier? Could performance improve without simply adding more size and power? Those questions sound obvious today, but industries rarely change because someone discovers an obvious question. They change because someone is willing to challenge the answer everyone else has accepted. And that's what made the original decision so important. It wasn't necessarily one single component, one dramatic machine, or one technological breakthrough that changed everything. The bigger story was the mindset behind the decision. CNC showed what could happen when a manufacturer stopped treating tradition as a limitation and started treating it as something that could be questioned. But there was another side to the story. Innovation always creates winners and losers. When customers begin demanding different things, manufacturers have to adapt. Designs evolve. Engineering priorities change. Features that were once considered unnecessary eventually become expected. What starts as an unusual idea at one company can become an industry standard years later. That is how technological change often happens. The first company to take a strange idea seriously may look foolish. The second company to adopt it looks ambitious. By the time everyone else is doing it, nobody remembers how strange the idea originally seemed. And that is why CNC's decision matters. The real transformation wasn't necessarily visible in one dramatic moment. It appeared gradually, through changing expectations and changing priorities. Heavy equipment became less about simply demonstrating brute force and increasingly about extracting useful performance from every part of the machine. For operators, that meant better tools for demanding work. For contractors, it meant thinking more carefully about productivity and operating costs. For manufacturers, it meant understanding that customers were no longer satisfied with impressive specifications alone. They wanted results. And perhaps the most surprising part is that the decision that started this chain reaction may have looked almost insignificant when it was first made. Nobody could have known exactly where it would lead. Nobody could have predicted how many competitors, engineers, and equipment buyers would eventually rethink their own assumptions. But history is often like that. The decisions that reshape an industry rarely announce themselves as history in the moment. They look like risks. They look strange. Sometimes they even look foolish. Until they work. And once they work, the world changes around them. CNC had taken that risk. Whether every decision was perfect is another question entirely. No manufacturer gets everything right, and no machine survives every environment without compromise. But the larger lesson remained. Progress begins when someone is willing to ask whether the old way is still the best way. That is the part of the story that can easily be missed. The crazy decision wasn't powerful because it was crazy. It was powerful because CNC was willing to make the decision before everyone else agreed with it. And that brings us to the final question. If CNC really helped push heavy equipment toward a smarter, more efficient, more operator-focused future, then what exactly was the hidden lesson behind the entire transformation? Was it a specific engineering breakthrough? A change in philosophy? Or was the real secret something much simpler? Something the industry had overlooked for generations? Because once you understand what CNC was actually trying to accomplish, the decision that seemed crazy at first begins to look completely different. And the final truth is where the story becomes most interesting. The final truth is that CNC's most important decision was never simply about building a different piece of heavy equipment. It was about questioning the definition of progress itself. In an industry where bigger, heavier, and more powerful had dominated the conversation for generations, CNC's approach suggested something far more important. The best machine isn't necessarily the machine with the biggest numbers. It's the machine that turns its capabilities into useful work more effectively than the machine beside it. That idea sounds simple, but its implications are enormous. Heavy equipment lives in a world where every minute has a price. When a machine is working, it is generating value. When it is consuming unnecessary fuel, losing efficiency, exhausting its operator, or sitting in a repair bay, that value disappears. Suddenly, design decisions that once seemed minor become critical. A machine's balance, controls, visibility, serviceability, durability, and efficiency can matter just as much as raw horsepower. And that is where CNC's crazy decision became something much bigger. The company had demonstrated that innovation doesn't always begin with a revolutionary invention. Sometimes it begins with refusing to accept an old assumption. Once engineers start asking different questions, they begin finding different solutions. Once customers see those solutions working, their expectations change. And once expectations change, the entire industry eventually has to respond. That is how an industry evolves. The companies that survive aren't always the companies that invent everything first. They're the companies willing to recognize when the rules are changing. CNC's story became a powerful example of that principle because its influence wasn't measured only by what happened inside its own operation. The bigger impact was the pressure it helped create for a smarter approach to heavy equipment. The industry could no longer look only at size and horsepower and declare victory. Customers wanted productivity. They wanted reliability. They wanted lower operating costs. Operators wanted machines that worked with them instead of forcing them to fight the equipment all day. Fleet owners wanted investments that delivered value over thousands of operating hours. And manufacturers had to understand that these demands were not temporary. The machine itself was becoming only part of the equation. The real product was productivity. And once that became clear, the old way of thinking became much harder to defend. That is why the title of this story isn't really about one crazy decision. It's about what happens when someone is willing to make a decision that seems crazy before the rest of the world understands it. At the time, CNC could have simply followed the market. It could have copied established formulas, built machines according to familiar expectations, and avoided the risks that come with challenging convention. That would have been safer. But safe decisions rarely change industries. The decision to do something differently created uncertainty, pressure, and enormous responsibility. It meant proving the idea in environments where failure is expensive. It meant listening to operators. It meant learning from problems. It meant continuing to improve even after the original concept began attracting attention. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson heavy equipment can teach us. Progress isn't always loud. Sometimes it begins inside a workshop, with an engineer asking one uncomfortable question. Sometimes it starts with a manufacturer deciding that an accepted solution isn't good enough anymore. And sometimes the decision that looks completely irrational today becomes the standard everyone else follows tomorrow. CNC's story is ultimately a reminder that industries don't change because everyone agrees at the same time. They change because someone moves first. The company took a risk by challenging the conventional formula, and that risk became part of a much larger transformation in the way heavy equipment was designed, evaluated, and used. The machines still had to work. They still had to survive. They still had to earn their keep. But the definition of what made them great had expanded. And that may be the real reason the decision mattered. CNC didn't need to prove that bigger machines were bad. It needed to prove that bigger wasn't the only definition of better. Once that idea took hold, the heavy equipment industry could never look at machines in quite the same way again. So the next time you see a massive excavator tearing through rock, a loader moving impossible amounts of material, or a construction machine working for hours without stopping, remember that the story behind modern heavy equipment isn't only about horsepower and steel. It's also about the people willing to challenge the assumptions everyone else accepted. CNC made one decision that seemed crazy. The industry changed because someone was willing to make it. And perhaps the strangest part is this. The most important breakthroughs in heavy equipment may still be the ones that look completely unreasonable, right up until the moment they work. If this story surprised you, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel for more stories about the machines, companies, and decisions that changed entire industries, and tell us in the comments. What do you think is the most revolutionary decision ever made in heavy equipment?